Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is TheiPadCat and welcome to the second episode of my The Last of Us Could Have Been Very Different series, where we reconstruct and discuss one of the original The Last of Us storyboards. I would strongly suggest you watch this series in chronological order since it would be harder to understand if you didn't, and I doubt it would make much sense. Anyways, let's not delay any further. It's time to pick up where we left off and
get on with it.
Late winter, 20 years later. Sunlight shines in through a partly boarded up frosty window at a much older Joel. Waking up abruptly, almost gasping for air, he sits up in his bed, memories mixed with dreams of his daughter still vividly whirling around in his head. He doesn't get any time to get a grip before his partner in crime, Tess, barges into the apartment.
Well, I have some interesting news for you.
She tells him she's landed him a new job, but before Joel can ask any questions, Tess drags him outside. It's freezing and snowing slightly, though not enough to hide the skeleton of the former Boston skyline and its reminder of the end of the world. As they walk out, a brute-looking man comes up to Tess and asks in an annoyed voice what took her so long. Tess looks at him and firmly reminds him that even though he's her brother, she's the boss and that he's got other things to worry about. Even though Joel and Tess lived and worked together, he rarely ever interacted or met with her henchmen, even her own brother, Dan. Joel realized he was getting caught up in his thoughts and jogged a bit to catch up to Tess and her brother. As they left the apartment compound where they lived and turned out toward the main street close to Checkpoint 5, they pass an impromptu Fedra medical control, where several civilians are held down by soldiers as they get scanned for infection. One after one, they're killed, either trying to escape or getting positive results for CBI.
No, I'm not infected.
Hold her down.
Do it. Please.
Dan mockingly remarks over the stupidity of the victims, to which Joel grunts in semi-agreement. Tess tells them both to cut it out and get ready to pass the checkpoint. But before they can do anything, one of the Fedra trucks passing through it explodes and gunfire erupts. Soldiers bark at them to leave the area immediately and they're forced to take a detour. Passing through an old run-down office building, now a makeshift home for many QZ citizens, they make their way to a secret passage leading down into a cellar. Fortunately for Tess and Joel, they had left some of their gear in the cellar previously, and naturally decide to get it. Eager to get on the job, Dan takes point and starts to make his way forward toward the exit, as Joel and Tess gear up. Joel decides to take this opportunity to ask about this supposedly well-paying job further with Tess. She tells him it's some sort of cargo Marlene and the Fireflies were desperate to get out of the city, and Fedra's way. Joel gets a bit wary as he hears it, but Tess quickly notices and tells him it'll be a simple routine pick up and drop off. Easy, they were smugglers after all. Seeing her point, he still can't be comfortable with it, perhaps due to his horrible nightmare reliving the outbreak and the death of his daughter just a short while earlier. Finally they reach the end of the tunnel and climb up through the floor into the remains of an old liquor store. They are now in the ghetto parts of the quarantine zone. Before they exit the store, Dan pulls out a walkie-talkie and asks if his henchmen are nearby. He looks at Joel and Tess and says, "Just insurance, if anything were to go south." The three then proceed to get out into the ghetto. This particular part of it was a little shanty town built in an old alleyway. Joel and Tess had been there many times before for jobs, but something was different now. They noticed there are very few people around. Confused, they continue around the corner, and suddenly a lot of heavily armed thugs in bulletproof vests are everywhere around them. Guns and thugs aren't exactly a new thing in the ghetto, but this is something else. Joel whispers under his breath how he's got a bad feeling about the whole thing. They walk further down through the rugged settlement and pass through an old school bus. On the other side, they run into none other than Marlene. Tess and Joel walk out to get the details on the job. As Tess starts to ask for them, Marlene proceeds to whistle, giving some sort of signal. One of the thugs, now obvious to Joel, a badly disguised Firefly, goes up to a nearby shack and knocks on the door. And out walks, to the pair's surprise, what seemed to be a doctor and a young teenage girl. Marlene proceeds to tell them that she needs the girl out of the city as soon as possible. But, being also reminded of his past and the fact that this was no routine operation, Joel angrily interrupts her and protests. But before Marlene has a chance to respond, Dan and a dozen of his and Tess's thugs get out of the school bus they passed through earlier. Dan, even more angry, demands to know why they were told it was an ordinary job, approaches Marlene. Not getting any answer, he raises his gun, which immediately causes all of the nearby Fireflies to point their guns at him, and his thugs pointing guns at them. The sun begins to set as the two groups are locked into a standoff, until suddenly, by mistake or intention, a Firefly fires his rifle and kills one of Dan's thugs. Before long, the quiet shantytown is turned into a shooting gallery. Tess, Joel, Marlene, and the girl and the doctor hurry away from the scene into another alleyway to safety. Marlene and Tess immediately begin aggressively arguing until the shooting abruptly stops. After a little while, one of Dan's henchmen walks into the alley and is about to shoot Marlene, but the Queen Firefly is quicker, pulls out her gun and kills him. Boiling with rage, Dan comes along not long after, rifle drawn, pointed at Marlene, yelling how it was her plan all along to kill them all. Marlene tries to defend herself, but to no avail. Dan continues towards her, having every intention to kill her. But before he can do it, Tess steps in front of him and argues that he can still get the job done, and with the pay replace all those henchmen who were just disposable anyways. But Dan only tells her to get out of his way. Just as he's about to kill Marlene, Joel pulls out his revolver, not really knowing why, since Dan technically is his ally, and shoots him at point-blank range. The sound throws all of them off guard, but Marlene, the doctor, and the girl take their chance and make a hasty retreat. Tess falls to her knees, letting out a screaming no at the body of her dead brother. Joel, not knowing what to do, just stands behind her until he hears the voices of Fedra soldiers closing in, demanding that any survivors surrender themselves immediately for having disturbed the peace and broken curfew. Failing to get Tess to follow him and deeming it unwise to tempt fate, he takes off into the now very dark alley, the way the remaining Fireflies had fled. Soldiers tight on his heels, he dodges trash, concrete barriers and decrepit cars until he finally reaches the Charles River. The Fireflies are standing on one of the few remaining jetties, getting into a small motorboat. Marlene sees Joel and yells for him to get there immediately. Hearing the engine sounds of Fedra APCs closing in and the angry voices of soldiers, Joel doesn't think twice. He runs out on the jetty as the first few soldiers round the alleyway corner he came out of and open fire on them. Narrowly escaping, Joel throws himself into the boat and Marlene accelerates, taking them upriver toward the inland. Fedra continues to pursue the group from the riverside in their APCs, but are ironically stopped by one of their own checkpoints in the way by a bridge. After leaving the danger zone and slowing down, the teenage girl turns to Marlene and cockily questions why they still need Joel. And as they continue their way on the river, dividing the desolate nighttime Boston landscape, she answers her by name, Ellie, that they still could need a capable smuggler. Okay, that was a really long segment, but that's because this part, the late winter/early spring part, is the longest segment on the entire storyboard timeline. And it's actually still not done. But I figured we gotta switch it up a bit before we finish it. Now, as with the prologue in the last episode, the vast majority of this I just made up, and it's probably not very close to what Naughty Dog had in mind. But it wouldn't make much of a video if I just read Meet Tess Bro Dan, CD Ghetto, collect your shit, etc. Now, this is where the story starts to quite drastically differ from The Last of Us we know. To begin with, I find it very weird how in this version, Tess is the villain, but she still lives with Joel at the start of the game. I always thought she was just a leader of a gang of thugs hunting Ellie and Joel down for some reason, but apparently not. That means there has to have been some sort of betrayal somewhere along the way, and the only thing I could make out that would be that betrayal from the board was Joel killing Dan. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Speaking of Dan, Tess was supposed to have a brother named Dan, or I assume so, since the post-it is saying Tess's bro, which technically could mean they're just friends, but I'm leaning more towards brother. This Dan apparently has his own soldiers as seen on this post-it, which sort of makes me feel that Tess and this Dan were more sort of mob bosses rather than the smugglers with connections we see in the actual game. Tess, seemingly knowing and being respected by everyone in the ghetto in the actual game, might be a leftover from this stage of story development. Or it might just be that it's there to showcase and support the notion of her being the mastermind of what is hinted at but never told or shown, to be a pretty sophisticated black market operation. Moving on, it also seems as if Joel was more of an employee rather than a partner in this version, which is kind of contradicted by the fact that he lives with Tess. But I think Dan was the character to have that role instead of Joel, which does make sense since it wouldn't be very logical if Tess and Joel were as close as they are in the real game, and then suddenly the sole purpose of her existence becomes to kill Joel. That might be something you do to a traitor, but not a former, well, we don't really know, but almost lover. I also find it interesting that there is this second character that's just responsible for Ellie within the Fireflies besides Marlene, which is unnamed and is just called the Doctor. I don't really see how this character fits into the story other than being there to perhaps explain a bit more about the CBI and how Ellie is immune, and then of course be there to show how people get infected, which we'll get to soon. Maybe a similar death to Tess in the actual game. To me, so far it seems like the character roster is way too crowded. Too many people that are supposed to be centerpieces in the story, when in reality it's supposed to be about Joel and Ellie. So I think the decision was made, somewhere down the line, to shave off, so to speak, these extra characters, only really there as plot devices, and add what was left over to the more integral ones. Instead of having the middleman Doctor, Marlene is the sole point of contact with the Fireflies. And well, even though Tess's role is very different in the game we got, she might have gotten some traits or parts of the story meant for Dan. I'm glad we don't have these many characters in the final game, because it would just distract and take away from Joel and Ellie. Even though this is very different, you can still see how it eventually evolved into The Last of Us we know and love. Pretty much all of the locations and story events are there. They go through the Fedra areas, then to the ghetto where they get their gear, then they meet Ellie and find out about the job, Marlene is there, but they have to escape because soldiers are coming and so on. Obviously it would have played out very differently, but still, the foundation was there. Anyways, that is all we have time for today. In the next episode we'll finish up the late winter/early spring season, so be sure to not miss that. What do you think of the story differing so much from what we got in this version? Do you think I did a good job of filling out the blanks? Do you agree or disagree with my discussion points? Tell me in the comments down below and let's discuss it. Before I go, I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Tranners, who helped me edit the mess of a script for this video and adding some extra insight to the discussion segment. And until next time, have a great day.